Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kim Ricketts, and I manage with Kirsten Wiley the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. And today we welcome David Evans here to discuss his work on software platforms and to tell the stories of the most successful software engines of our times and how these invisible engines are driven by economic factors and not necessarily technological ones. How many cutting-edge ideas have dropped off the face of the earth after failing to capture an audience and make money? He will discuss what separates success from failure in some applications and argue that it is determined by a delicate mix of pricing and product design decisions and a keen knowledge of the economics as well. David is the founder of Market Platform Dynamics and a visiting professor at University College London. His company works with leadership teams in different companies to design products and develop pricing strategies to bring innovation platforms to the market. So please welcome David Evans.
Thanks very much for having me today. In the next few minutes, I'm going to begin by not talking about anything having to do with software platforms, but instead I want to start out with a few sort of commonplace puzzles. And one of the puzzles I like to start out with, before we started today, we're talking a little bit about shopping malls nearby, and I asked about some of the close ones, and someone mentioned Pacific Place, and how annoying it was that when you go to Pacific Place, in order to go from top to bottom, you have to walk across, I guess, the mall in order to go down the escalator and up the escalator. And that's actually a very common annoying thing about shopping malls all around the country. For two-level malls, the escalators tend to be at opposite ends of the mall. So here's another puzzle I have, and I brought props today. Here's an issue of Vogue, which isn't a magazine that I read very much. But one of the puzzles about Vogue is if you want to find the table of contents in Vogue, so you have to turn to page 24 to find the first page of the table of contents. So you have to thumb through to find the first page. And then the other thing that's really kind of annoying is to find the continuation of the table of contents. You have to flip forward and, let's see, so then you go to page 30 to find the continuation of it. And then you flip forward a little bit farther, and the continuation is on page 36, which is kind of an annoying feature of this particular magazine. And you have the same problem when you want to read stories in Vogue magazine, and this is true for other magazines as well. It's really hard to find the continuation. So that's another odd fact of life that I like to talk about a little bit. And then the final one that I want to spend a little bit of time on is credit cards. I mean, we're all very annoyed when we go home and open up our mailboxes and they're just stuffed with credit card solicitations, most of them offering us all sorts of rewards. And some of us are kind of puzzled at that because I at least don't revolve my credit card balance. That doesn't seem like a very smart thing to do. So I don't revolve, yet I get all these credit card offers and all these fantastic reward programs and so forth. So one of the things I like to do in the next 40 minutes is to show you how the new economics of multi-sided platforms helps answer some of those puzzles. And also, as it turns out, provide some insights into software platforms, your core business. So in the next few minutes, I'd actually like to continue on by not talking at all about software platforms, but continuing with the businesses that I've just introduced. So let's take shopping malls as an example, and just to motivate this, that's a picture not of Pacific Place, but of the largest shopping mall in America, which is the Mall of America in Minneapolis. So let me tell you a little bit about shopping malls. These have been around in some form for a century, if not more, depending upon how you define them. But the modern shopping mall in America was created by a fellow by the name of Victor Gruen, who set up the first mall in Southdale, the Southdale Mall outside of Minneapolis. And this particular mall is really the model for all shopping malls in the United States. It's a for most shopping malls in the United States. It's a two-level mall. It has anchor stores, significant stores like a Nordstrom's or a Neiman Marcus at opposite ends, and then lots of stores in the middle, and then there's a courtyard in between. That's the basic design of the American shopping mall. Has become just incredibly popular. What's the business model of a shopping mall? Well, the business model is shoppers, by and large, in most malls, get in for free. Sometimes they may have to pay for parking, but oftentimes even parking is free. Indeed, at a lot of shopping malls, at Christmas time you get free food and entertainment and so forth. So shoppers typically don't pay anything to get into a shopping mall. At least they don't pay anything to the shopping mall owner and developer. Merchants, on the other hand, do pay. Merchants pay rent, and a lot of shopping mall operations, they also pay some commission on the store sales, and that's the business model of the shopping mall. And of course, as we probably all realize after reflecting on it for about a nanosecond, the reason the escalators are at opposite ends of the mall is because the shopping mall owner wants to encourage traffic. He wants the shoppers to circulate around the different stores because that's what the merchants want. They want the foot traffic, and that's also going to generate sales for him. So that's the shopping mall model. So let me turn to advertising-supported media, of which Vogue is an example. So there's a picture. So we have different issues of Vogue here. So if you go back to the 19th century, magazines in the United States actually did not have advertising in them. The typical model for a magazine in America and most countries in the 19th century was people paid for the magazine and there are articles in it, and it was a very simple business model. The owner of the magazine basically paid for content. Those are his suppliers or employees, as the case may be, put it between the covers, and sold the magazine for a fee. Then in the late 19th century, a couple of publishers facing financial problems came up with the idea of putting advertising in the magazine. Now, this wasn't the invention of advertising-supported media because that actually goes back a long ways with newspapers, but at least for magazines in the United States, late 19th century, about 1895 or so, Muncie magazine and another magazine introduced advertising in their magazines. And over the next 10 or 20 years, the magazine industry in the United States flipped from being basically an advertising-supported industry where, by and large, readers didn't pay that much. In fact, the typical model for magazines is once you take into account production costs and so forth, readers get a really good deal. On the other hand, the advertisers, just as with Google and MSN and advertising-supported media, the money basically comes from the advertising side. Now, just as with the shopping malls, the explanation for why you have to work so hard to find the table of contents and articles in a magazine like Vogue is just as the shopping mall wants to get consumers, shoppers, to walk around the different storefronts. Likewise, a magazine like Vogue wants to get readers to go through the advertisements. And you think about the process of finding the table of contents, you have to go through a lot of ads just to find it, and to find the continuation even more. And if you want to look at the continuation of articles, again, you're basically forced to walk by, in effect, the advertisements. And that's a very conscious decision on the part of the magazine. Now, one of the interesting things about magazines, and this is true for some of the other business models that we're going to talk about, is they're not all the same. So, for example, People magazine is actually a little bit different than Vogue. So if I look at People magazine, and if I'm interested in finding out the story about Britney files for divorce, it's real easy. I just open the magazine. I go to okay, so there's an advertisement for Citicorp on the first and second page, but then easy to find table of contents starting on page 3. I go to page 4. There's the continuation of the table of contents. And the other neat thing about People magazine, and this is also true for The Economist, is there's a page number down on the right-hand corner of every page. So it's very easy to find out where you are in the magazine. Whereas With Vogue, not only is the table of contents separated, they tell you go to page 36, but there are no page numbers to actually make it easy for you to do that. Now, these are examples of magazines that have followed somewhat different business models. This is what I would call a advertiser-friendly platform. Basically, this magazine doesn't charge subscribers much. You can get this magazine from Amazon for $18 a year, whereas this is $118 a year. Question here.
I know some people who really like to buy Vogue for the ads. That's
Yep.
that's what they want.
Yep. No, I mean
That's different for other magazines. I don't know if anyone does that for other types of magazines.
Well, I mean, I think it's true for some magazines, not true for other magazines, and this is one of the big debates in advertising-supported media, which is do consumers like the ads or not? I mean, people talk about consumers not liking the ads on TV. There's a dispute about that, but I take your point that in Vogue, a lot of the people who buy Vogue view the advertisements as part of the content of the magazine, and I take that point absolutely. So that's a very good point. The observation I want to make, though, is that People magazine is it really is a much more of a reader-friendly magazine in terms of the advertisements. On the other hand, it's a more expensive magazine, whereas this magazine is a much more advertiser-friendly magazine, accepting your point that a lot of the consumers do like the advertisements. This is very inexpensive from the consumer standpoint, but very centered on this is an advertising medium. Again, there are two groups of consumers here for both People and Vogue, and potentially two sources of revenue and two sources of profit, which are consumers and advertisers, of course. Let me turn now to payment cards, which is another interesting example of the kind of business that I want to focus on. So let me give you a little bit of background on the history of payment cards. Up until 1950 in the United States and also throughout the world, payment cards were basically provided by stores. So you could go to stores and you could buy on installment. You could have monthly charges, and the store would give you a card that you could present as identification that basically allowed you to do that. Diners Club came in 1950 Manhattan with basically a new business model with what I would call the general purpose charge card or general purpose payment card. And the business model here is you have a single card network. You get merchants to sign up and you get cardholders to sign up, and they can use that network as basically a mechanism for the consumer to pay the merchant. Now, this was introduced in Manhattan in 1950 by a fellow by the name of Frank McNamara, and his business model for getting this system off the ground was to essentially give the card away to consumers. He literally gave it away at the start of the system and charge merchants, basically restaurants in Manhattan, 7% of the meal tab. Now, that business model where merchants basically pay the freight for the card system and consumers get a really good deal has really continued for the last 50 years. If you look at payment card systems in the United States and most parts of the world, they're essentially consumer or cardholder friendly systems in which the merchant ends up paying most of the freight. Now, in the case of Diners Club, eventually McNamara, Diners Club, started charging people an annual fee for the card, but that fee essentially just covered the cost of the float that consumers were getting as a result of only having to pay their card balances every 30 days or so. If you look at modern payment cards and think about the ones that you use, debit cards, you're really not paying anything for the transactions or for the card, although that gets complicated because it's bundled in with the bank account. If you take a look at credit cards, for those of us who don't revolve our balances, which is about half of the people who use credit cards, at least in terms of the dollar balances, you're not really paying much of anything for a card either. You get rewards, you have an annual fee, but the annual fee more or less covers the float. So by and large, for the vast amount of transactions that are conducted on payment cards around the world, it's essentially the merchant pays. The way the merchant pays in modern card systems is the system has something known as the interchange fee that gets passed on to the merchant, and that flows as income to the bank that issues that issues the cards. So getting back to why you have all these card solicitations in your mailbox and why you get all these lavish reward programs, basically the competition among banks is to sign up card holders in order to basically deliver those to merchants. So that interchange fee income is competed away. And there are some analogies here to what Google, for example, does today in terms of rebating some of the advertising revenue that it gets to syndicators and other providers of content, for example. The card industry is interesting, and this is, I'm just going to digress on this for a second. This actually turns out to be an interesting topic for Google and Microsoft and Yahoo and Amazon and lots of companies these days, because one of the things that's actually going on in eBay and so forth, one of the things that's going on in the card business today is there's a significant disruption, and there's a real drive to end the merchant hostile systems and replace them with a merchant-friendly system. Merchants, for various reasons, are very upset now about the charges they have to pay, and there's a drive in the business now to basically replace the business model. All right. What does all of this have to do with software platforms? Well, if you think about all the businesses that I talked about, and I can give you lots of additional examples, they're all businesses in which essentially there are two or more distinct consumer groups who at least could be sources of revenue. And the business model for the industries that I've just gone through are situations where there are two or more distinct groups of consumers who need each other in some way. And to go back to the example of Vogue, and your question on readers actually liking the advertisers makes this a little bit simpler story to tell. To the extent that they do, you have two groups of consumers here. You have advertisers and you have subscribers. And one of the things that this magazine does is it helps put them together. And it helps put together a particular kind of reader and a particular kind of advertiser and allows them to get mutual benefits. This is a platform. Now, if you take a look at software platforms, if you look across the full range, as I'm going to define software platforms later on in the talk, who are the customers for software platforms? Well, the customers are users, they're developers, they may be content providers, they may be hardware makers, they may in fact be advertisers depending upon the software platform that you're talking about. And all of those potential groups of customers, in effect, that are coming to the platform are potentially sources of revenue, even though there may be a decision that one particular group of customer gets things for free, as is the case in shopping malls, or maybe even get things at a significant discount, which is true for actually a lot of card transactions. But software platforms, like all the businesses that I've just talked about, are businesses generally, they don't have to be, but oftentimes they're businesses that have multiple groups of consumers that are coming together through the software platform and where the software platform is creating value. Now, there's a new science, a new economic science of multi-sided platforms. It started in around 2000 based on the work of a couple of friends of mine at the University of Toulouse. Started in France, but it's become a really hot topic in economics, and we've made tremendous advances in this discipline over the last 5 years. The basic insight from these guys, and the basic insight in the new economics of multi-sided platforms, is that there are lots of businesses, some of them new, but actually some of them very old, that are really based on essentially the same business model. And more importantly, that business model, as you try to understand the economics of it, the economics of that business model is actually very different from the economics that we have been taught really through a good portion of the 20th century. There are actually some deep economic insights in this literature that really turned out to be news to economists, and we've gotten them really as a result of recognizing this pattern that there are a lot of industries that follow this basic economic model. As I said, this has become one of the hottest areas in economics. There are conferences all the time on this. Lots of students are writing doctoral dissertations on it. If you're an assistant professor or a young person in the profession, especially if you're a theorist, this is something that people are really excited about. importantly for you and for businesses, this is also very quickly translating into a very new way of thinking in terms of business strategies and so forth. And there are lots of management insights that are coming from this literature as well. Now, this literature goes well beyond the tried and true literature on network effects. You've all heard about network effects, positive feedback loops, virtuous circles, and so forth. Now, it turns out that the economic literature that drove a lot of those insights into network effects, while it contributed quite a bit to our understanding of network industries, missed a bunch of fundamental points. And the most fundamental point that it missed, that turns out to be very, very important in this new science of multi-sided platforms, is the importance of balance. If you look at Vogue, if you look at credit cards, if you look at software platforms, if you look at singles clubs, if you look at exchanges, and so forth, it turns out that getting the customers on board the platform in the right proportion and getting the right customers on board the platform in the right proportion turns out to be critical. In fact, it turns out to be more critical than the tried and true wisdom that if you build share, the market will come to you. And the basic defect in the network economics literature and the advice that dot-com entrepreneurs and lots of people got in the late 1990s was this notion, this mechanical notion that if you simply build share and get these network effects, that somehow you have a business model. What this new literature emphasizes is that while share is important, while scale effects are important, what's really, really important is making sure that you have both sides on board and that you have a business model that maintains those two sides and is capable of, in effect, igniting a reaction between the multiple customer groups that are coming together on the platform. Now, the new science of multi-sided platforms is very relevant to anyone in the software platform business writ large. And when I say software platforms, I'm not just talking about Windows. I'm talking about Google's advertising search platform and lots of other things in the information technology world today. It turns out that the new literature on multi-sided platforms is very helpful for understanding those kind of businesses, in part because it has some interesting new theory, but also because by recognizing that lots of businesses share these characteristics, we've been able to pull together empirical information from a number of different industries to get a better understanding of how things work. So what I would like to do next is to summarize the new science, some of the results of the new science of multi-sided platforms. Now, the secret of all these businesses is figuring out some way to create value by bringing two or more sets of customers together. That's the basic insight for all these businesses. When you look at Diners Club, the apple that fell on Frank McNamara's head was the notion that by bringing merchants and cardholders together in a single platform, that was a way to create value. Now, if you take a look at the set of businesses that I talked about and the set of businesses that engage in bringing multiple groups of customers together, they do three different things. They act as matchmakers. So think about speed dating. They build audiences. So think about People Magazine, or think about Google. And they provide shared facilities that reduce costs and provide the elimination of duplication. Think Windows, or think shopping malls. Now, if you think deeply about all the businesses that I've just mentioned and all of your businesses, I think what you'll see quickly is that while you can think of matchmaking businesses and exchange businesses and audience building businesses and reducing cost kind of businesses, all these businesses do each of those things to some extent. So if you think about Vogue, what's Vogue doing? Well, We think of this as building audiences, advertising-supported media. But the other thing it's doing is it's a matchmaker. It's bringing particular kinds of advertisers and particular kinds of consumers together. It does that by product differentiation. So I don't read Vogue. And there are certain kind of women who do read Vogue and some who don't. The ones who read it are the ones who like the advertisements and the articles. If you think about Windows, the other thing it does, in addition to matchmaking, is in some sense it also reduces the cost to the advertisers. We tend to trivialize this because there are so many ways of doing this nowadays. But rather than having a billboard, these advertisers can all join, in effect, this single platform and put their ads between these pages. And there's an efficiency that's created there, much in the same way that Google creates efficiencies through its advertising platform. Now, if you think about Windows, in the multi-sided literature that I'm talking about, we think of Windows as fundamentally something that reduces the cost to application developers by having, in effect, shared facilities that application developers can use. And that provides benefits to the developers, but also benefits, obviously, to the end users as well. But, I mean, to some extent, you can think of Windows as also building up an audience for developers by accumulating users. You're, in effect, selling an audience to developers and vice versa. And this is less obvious in the case of Windows because Windows is such a standard nowadays. But if you think of something like Apple, which through product differentiation is able to match different kinds of developers with different kinds of consumers, and think about publishing software, for example. Now, there may seem a degree of inevitability in my discussion of multi-sided platforms. And one of the things that I should emphasize at the outset is that some businesses really have to be multi-sided platforms. If you're interested in getting into the dating club or matchmaking men and women business, you've got to have men and women. You have to have two sets of customers, and fundamentally, that is a two-sided business. There's no way around it. If you look at a lot of other businesses, though, the decision to operate a multi-sided platform is really a question of strategy. And probably the best way to see that is to take a look at magazines. As I said, 19th century magazines were not, in fact, advertising supported. There was a decision at some point to switch from being I pay for content, I put the content together, and I sell. Typical single-sided traditional supply chain kind of model. But then there was a switch over to being a two-sided or multi-sided model. If you take a look at credit cards, again, to take that as an example, prior to 1950, this was a single-sided traditional product. The merchant, as part of its overall services, provides a card to its customers. End of story. You don't have this two-sided platform aspect to it. If you take a look at iPod, that we'll get to later, versus Microsoft's pre-Zune strategy. That's another example, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, of a single-sided, in effect, versus a multi-sided strategy. And now we're kind of back to a single-sided strategy. So let me quickly summarize some of the key findings of the multi-sided literature. Number one, balance is absolutely critical. If you take a look at payment cards, the way Diners Club was able to start, Frank McNamara was able to get about 13 restaurants signed on in Manhattan to begin with, along with 300 consumers. So he had enough consumers, enough cardholders, and enough restaurants to ignite the system. Think about the alternative where he had one or two restaurants at 1,000 consumers or 10,000 consumers. He may have had that at the beginning, but if that's all he had, that would have been a difficult thing to ignite. So you got to have balance. Think about auctions in the same way. If you don't have enough buyers and sellers, it's very difficult to have a sensible auction site. If you only have a couple of buyers and a lot of sellers, that's obviously not going to work. So balance is critical for these platforms, and it's often the key problem that needs to be solved at the beginning, getting both the chicken and eggs on board and in the right proportion. So how to do that? Well, there are several things that turn out to be very critical for this. pricing is key to getting the balance right. Now, many of the examples that I've gone through are situations where one side gets the product for free, or if you think about it more deeply, gets the product at a price that's less than marginal cost. So if you think about newspapers, we all pay for newspapers, but if you think about the economics of that business, most of us get newspapers at a price that is less than the incremental cost of producing and distributing the newspaper. Shopping malls is an example of a situation where the price to shoppers is zero. If you look at the Windows model for developers, while developers pay for some things, some of the tools for Windows and so forth, I don't think you think of the tool development side of the business as a profit center. And there's an awful lot of stuff that developers really do get literally for free in the case of Windows. So pricing is key for a lot of these businesses. And if you think about the Diners Club model that I started with a couple of minutes ago, the notion of charging merchants and letting the cardholders in for free, that seems like a brilliant and obvious model in retrospect. But obviously it was a brilliant insight at the time. And for a lot of these businesses, getting the pricing right and knowing which side to charge and which side not to charge turns out to be the critical thing to get at the start of these businesses. I'm working with a lot of new firms in a variety of spaces at this point, and I can tell you that the basic thing that they're trying to figure out in all cases, this is especially true for anyone who's doing mobile content and so forth, getting the prices right, getting the balance right, and getting the sides on board and getting the economics of those two sides or three sides or four sides turns out to be critical. There's a new term in this literature that's actually probably very familiar to you, but we've adopted it in the economics of multi-sided platform, and that's the term multi-homing. So multi-homing for us is the multi-sided economics version of polygamy. So multi-homing simply means that the customers of the platform are using more than one platform. So most of us, for example, are getting news from multiple sources. If you look in your wallets, you almost certainly have a credit card, a debit card, maybe a charge card, maybe multiple of those. So you're multi-homing on cards. You're using multiple card platforms. If you go to a merchant, you'll notice that there are a lot of stickers on the door. So the merchant is also accepting a lot of cards. So the merchant is multi-homing as well. If you take a look at Windows, Windows is an example of a product where virtually all consumers, except for a handful of geeks, real extreme geeks, are basically single homing. They're just using Windows. They're not using Windows and the Mac OS, even if they have the new Mac OS that runs Windows. Very few people are doing that. Very few people are simultaneously running Windows and Linux. So that's an example, in effect, of single homing. But if you look at developers, a lot of developers multi-home in the sense that they develop for multiple platforms. And that's certainly true, for example, in video games. One of the implications of multi-homing is that if you're an owner of a platform business, you don't like multi-homing. You really would like people to be monogamous, and you like them to be monogamous on both sides. And therefore, platform businesses spend a lot of effort trying to persuade people to be monogamous. So eBay, for example, has been successful or pretty successful with its feedback forum in encouraging both merchants and consumers to be a little bit dedicated to that platform. And reward miles for credit cards do sort of the same thing, although not nearly as effectively. The other key strategy that the multi-sided economics literature emphasizes, and again, for those of you who study lots of different businesses, this will seem obvious, is called the marquee strategy, but lots of you may call it the anchor tenant strategy. In order to get the two sides on board the platform, one of the things that is a common strategy in lots of these businesses is to get a prestige customer on one side, because by doing that, you'll attract customers on the other side. So Frank McNamara with the credit card, he gets a number of the elite restaurants in Manhattan on board his platform. that's good for attracting card holders. If you go to a shopping mall, there's a Nordstrom's or a Macy's or a Saks or whatever, and that tends to anchor the mall and attracts other stores. And there are lots of examples of this. In the case of video games, obviously, if you want to start a new video game platform, one of the things you want to do is you want to get a really, really great game to sort of anchor that platform in order to get customers on the other side. Now, multi-sided platforms, as I've defined them, have been around for millennia, almost since the beginning of time. But to go back to some of the old famous multi-sided platforms, so the Rome Forum is an example of a multi-sided platform. If you go to China, in China, marriage brokers are sort of like investment bankers. They're called Meiren, and basically they acted like investment bankers, and they had term sheets, and they brought men and women together, and there are lots of those kind of businesses that have been around, again, for millennia. If you go back to the start of money, the modern money, coins, was basically invented in Lydia in about 700 BC. That was a state basically entering the platform business by creating a payment instrument, a standardized coin that both buyers and sellers would be willing to use. So these kind of platforms go back for a very long number of years. However, what's really exciting about this area now is that this branch of economics and business strategy helps elucidate lots of businesses that are starting up at the beginning of the 21st century. And the reason this is happening, the reason we're seeing a lot more platform businesses nowadays is because, as you all know, reduced communication costs, reduced data processing costs. It's much easier to operate these platforms on a virtual basis, and the whole idea of putting together communities and so forth is much easier now than it ever was. So I haven't really talked about the book yet, and somewhere around I have somewhere around there's a copy of the book. Yeah, let me see if I have a copy of the book. Oh, we have lots of copies of the book. Okay, so I'm actually going to get to another book at the end of my talk, but this is Invisible Engines, and what Invisible Engines does is it really uses the framework of multi-sided platform economics to glean insights in a bunch of different industries. So we use the lens of multi-sided economics to study the obvious ones, the history of personal computers and the birth of the Windows platform and the Mac platform and so forth. But we also study video games, we study PDAs, we study digital media, and we study lots of examples of mobile phones. We study e-tailing, and we study advertising-supported search engines, although not as deeply as we do some of the other industries. And basically, the idea behind the book is to use the lens of multi-sided economics to get an understanding by looking across these diverse industries of the strategies that have worked and the strategies that haven't worked. So that's what the book is about. So let me not say so much that you don't pick up copies of the book. So let me just highlight a few things that we do in the book, and then I want to quickly at the end talk about another book that I have coming out in a few months, which is more of a management book. So one of the interesting things, if you look across the diversity of software platform businesses and platform businesses more generally, is there's a very fundamental decision to be made early on and over the course of the development of the business and the industry, which is how do you architect, how do you design the ecosystem that you want to be in. As I mentioned before, for many of these businesses, being multi-sided is really a strategic choice. In the case of digital media players, Apple, for all intents and purposes, went single-sided, and we can talk if you have any questions about why I view the Apple iPod iTunes as essentially a single-sided model, whereas Microsoft up until recently went multi-sided. Apple made the decision to basically control all aspects of its supply chain, and in effect sold a single experience to the consumer. Microsoft, on the other hand, took the traditional strategy, which was common for Microsoft but also common for many other software platforms, of producing a software platform and then trying to build an ecosystem with hardware manufacturers and content providers and so forth, and customers obviously all coming together on that platform. Now, there are advantages and the disadvantages of those two approaches. The advantage, obviously, of the single-sided approach is that you get to control all aspects of the consumer experience. You get to have very tight integration of all the components, and that has certain advantages. And in particular, it has very significant advantages when you're trying to ignite a market and trying to attract consumers on one side in order to get things going. And I'll give an example of that in just a second. The advantage of the multi-sided approach, as Microsoft has learned with Windows and a number of other of its successful platforms, is that the multi-sided approach tends to really fuel scale effects. It tends to really ignite these positive feedback effects because you have all these customers coming on one side, and I'm thinking about developers as in effect customers helping to fuel users on the other side, and then back and forth. And that's certainly the case with the example of Diners Club. By having this multi-sided model, Diners Club and the payment card industry generally has been able to get both cardholders and merchants basically feeding on each other and growing the system explosively. So there are advantages and the disadvantages of both. One of the things that we see, yeah.
Help me differentiate between kind of a platform and a marketplace in single-sided and multi-sided, because like an iPod, of course, you're having people be able to buy music from music suppliers, and that's clearly a marketplace. It's not really a platform in the sense that it's a closed model, agreed, but it is analogous to like the shopping mall shopper store up there. So is that shopping mall a platform in your mind, or marketplace, or is like that shopping mall, is that a multi-sided?
Now, which shopping mall are you talking about?
Well, the industry you've got right there. No, go back to the table.
Yep.
You got multiple industries there. Shopping mall, is that like a platform in your mind?
Yeah, the shopping mall is a platform. So, yep, and it's a multi-sided platform. So
that's a shopper in stores, and an iPod is a set of shoppers in stores.
No, but it's really a different business model. Okay. So if you think about the shopping mall model, the developer builds a mall, and you have an empty space. And at that point, in order to have a business, it needs two sets of customers, and it can derive revenue from either or both sets of customers in that situation. And in the case of the shopping malls, what it does is it rents space to the merchants. And the merchants don't have to stay there forever. They stay there at the decision of the shopping mall. The shopping mall decides what stores can be there. It makes all those decisions to define the experience of the shopping mall. But it makes money by renting space to the stores and by taking a cut, oftentimes, of the sales. And it does a variety of things in order to attract the shoppers.
So iPod, clearly they can charge you an upfront fee for the device. They can charge you a subscription fee. They can charge you a per song fee, and they can also charge access to the suppliers of the music.
Yeah. So in this area, the iPod iTunes example is actually a little bit of this in supermarkets, where there's also a question of the extent to which it gets into the two-sided aspect of this. There's actually some debate within people who are in this literature on how exactly to think about the iPod iTunes example. The way I think about the iPod iTunes example, and the best way to see this is to contrast it with what Microsoft has done. If you think about the iPod, iTunes example, for all intents and purposes, it's a supply chain in the following sense, although you can debate aspects of this. Apple is interested in basically selling stuff to end consumers. And from its standpoint, the content providers are people that it is going to basically saying buy music is a little bit inaccurate. But for all intents and purposes, you have the content providers that are basically selling stuff to Apple just like you would sell stuff to a supermarket. Apple then puts that on the iTunes store, and then that's made available to the Apple consumers. Apple is not spending the kind of effort that you would think about with many platforms in evangelizing itself for the content provider side. There's an economic transaction there. It's essentially engaging in an economic transaction with the content providers, and I don't want to make that too extreme. Okay.
So the opposite, Microsoft, you're talking about the Zune?
Yep. No. I'm not talking about the Zune. I'm talking about pre-Zune. So the Microsoft strategy pre-Zune is you create a software platform, and the way you monetize that software platform, or the way you hope to monetize that software platform, is just as with Windows. Your customers are in effect the suppliers of the hardware. It's the consumers, obviously, and it's also content providers and web portals, basically anyone that's willing to set up a business to provide content to the users of that software platform. And you can think of each one of those groups as, in effect, a set of customers for you.
And clearly, in that case, the platform failed relative to iPod, right?
Yes. It has not yet succeeded.
Okay.
Okay?
Yep.
So that's the distinction. And there are complexities here, and there are a number of businesses that are, I characterize them as one-sided going on two. An example of a one-sided business going on two is Walmart, for example, where in a lot of ways it's buy stuff, sell to consumers, but Walmart is getting to the point where it's in effect a platform with shelf space that it is making available to businesses, and that's an example of a one-sided going on two. Okay. The next thing I just wanted to touch briefly, because I think I'm running out of how much time? Just a few more minutes.
Yeah, and then we want to take some questions.
Yeah, I want to take some questions. So I think what I'm going to do is I want to talk briefly just about some pricing principles, and I'm going to go to the blackboard to do this. So the interesting thing about these kind of platform businesses is when you think about how to monetize the platform, there are a few dimensions you can play with. And there are other businesses where this may also be true, but it's particularly interesting in the case of platforms. So in the case of platforms, you can think about two kinds of fees to charge people. You can think about, economists would say fixed fees and variable fees, but you can think of access fees and usage fees. So think about a charge for access, and you can think about a charge for usage, and you have both sets of fees that you can charge to group 1 and to group 2. And if you take a look at software platforms generally, but also multi-sided platforms generally, you see a lot of variation in how people have solved the monetizing the platform by making different choices on the extent to which they have access fees and usage fees for custom group 1 or customer group 2, and I'm just doing the two-sided example here. There obviously can be more. And the extent to which these are positive or negative, the extent to which they're making profits on this. So let me give you an example of credit cards. So we have card holders and we have merchants. And think about the economics of that business, putting the financing aspect of credit cards off to one side. So in the case of card holders, many cards have a fixed fee, which is positive. But lots of cards don't have an explicit usage charge. No one has ever been charged a per transaction fee for using a card. But lots of cards have rewards or some other inducement to actually use the card for transactions. So cards are, this is only true for some cards, so I would characterize it as a usage fee that is 0 or negative. People are paid to use the card. Think about it from the standpoint of merchants, on the other hand. Merchants, by and large, don't have to pay anything in order to accept cards, aside from getting the terminal equipment and maybe some initial sign-up charge. So they're essentially 0. But on the other hand, they do pay a transaction fee. So a typical merchant will pay somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5% to 3% in order to use cards. So this is the business model that has basically been used in the card industry. And as I mentioned before, the net effect of these is putting the credit card financing feature of cards aside. This doesn't generate profits. This does. Let me give you another example, which is advertising supported media. So let's do, which is close to your hearts, I know. So take the advertiser and take the reader, and think about how that platform is typically monetized in the case of newspapers and magazines. The advertisers typically don't have any setup charge, any entry fee to getting on the platform, so that's typically 0. And while you may think of there being an impression, you may think of Vogue as having a fee of $100,000 or $200,000 for an ad. If you look at the business overall, it's basically an impressions-based business. So television and newspapers and magazines and so forth, it's really a usage fee in the sense that it's the number of eyeballs that are expected to see the ad that is the source of the fee, even though it may be a lump sum fee. In the case of the reader, it's interesting. There's a small positive fee for access, the subscription fee for the magazine, which again is typically subsidized. On the other hand, there's no fee at all for usage. You're not paid according to the number of times you look at the magazine and so forth. And then let me just quickly go to software platforms and give you my take on this. So in this case, we'll have distributors, developers, software developers. So we have ISVs and we have users. Think about the fees that most software platforms charge. There's essentially no usage fee. No one's charged typically for the extent to which they're using APIs, although if you start taking a look at Google as a software platform, we can have a discussion over that. But for most software platforms, there's no usage fee for the API set to the users. To the extent that there's an access fee, I would argue that the access fee for ISVs is probably subsidized. But you could argue that it's 0, or you could argue that you're charging them a little bit of money. But I would say that it's probably negative. And then if you look at the user side, users are charged a fee basically for access to the platform. You're charged a fee to either the OEM is charged a fee or the end user is charged a fee if it's the 3 people who buy at retail. There's an access fee for the software platform. But then, at least at the moment, with the model that you and most people have at the moment, there's really no usage fee. So that's the economic model for software platforms. And the only point I really wanted to get with this is that how you check off these boxes is very important for monetizing the platform. And it is a matter of discretion. And one of the interesting things that we highlight in the book is the distinction between the business model for traditional software platforms like Windows and Symbian and so forth, and another important software platform, which is the software platforms for video game consoles. So if you look at the software platform for video game consoles, and I'm going to move on from here. If you look at the business model for video game consoles, the buyer of the software platform on the video game console is basically being subsidized. You get the console for generally something that's at manufacturing cost or even maybe a little bit less. You're not charged for how often you use the platform. If, on the other hand, you're a game developer, unlike the Windows, Apple, Symbian model of traditional software platforms, the money is actually made on the developer side of the business, and it's made by, in effect, a usage fee, since it's you can think of it as a usage fee, since it's in effect a percent of the game revenue that the game developer is getting from the users. So the only point here is there are very interesting differences in terms of the how things are monetized, and lots of degrees of freedom for these multi-sided models that turn out to be quite interesting. So let me actually show you one cartoon. I was going to talk to you about bundling. This just demonstrates that we have cartoons in the book. One of my favorites here. And then just a quick advertisement for my next book, which is actually a general book on two-sided platforms, multi-sided platforms that covers really everything. It's written for a managerial audience. This is the framework that we develop in that book, and the kind of insights that we provide to businesses that are starting platforms in a lot of different areas. And then that's actually the book, which is coming out in May. I feel a little bit bad that I'm free writing on an MIT press-sponsored event with a book at the end published by Harvard Business School Press, but hopefully it won't get back to them. And of course, Harvard Business School would be happy to do the reverse. So the book that's coming out in May is Catalyst Code by me and Dick Schmalensee, which is an application of the general framework of multi-sided economics to very diverse businesses, everything from 8-minute dating to hospitals to shopping malls, to one of my favorites, which is Roppongi Hills in the middle of Tokyo, which is an example of a big shopping mall, kind of a city within a city. And we go through some of the insights there. So let me stop there and take any questions that people have. Thank you. Yeah.
Can you give us some examples of platforms that have like 3 or 4 or a larger number of sides?
Yeah. So an example of a platform that has multiple sides would be any platform. To give you an example, that so let's take Windows. Let's take Windows Media Player as an example. So Windows Media Player and your Windows Media platform. Think of that as a software platform. Okay. That platform has content providers, it has device manufacturers, and it has end users. So that's an example of and I'm sorry, and it actually has another side, which are application developers. So you have content providers that are using the Windows Media Platform in order to encode and distribute content. You have application developers who are using it to develop applications using the API set. You have end users, and to some extent you have hardware manufacturers that may be using it, and some of the APIs and protocols that are exposed in order to do hardware devices. If you take a look at Yahoo, so Yahoo has it has content provision, it has advertisers, and it has users. So that's a three-sided platform. Now, if you look across platforms generally, I'd say that the predominance of them are in fact two-sided. Now, one of the interesting things that I wasn't able to cover is the really scary thing for any kind of a platform business is what I call colliding or intersecting catalysts. And that's the situation where you're a platform with sides A and B, and there's a new platform that's created which has sides A, B, and C, or has sides B and C, but where the sources of revenue are different. So you can think of this as Google were to get into web-based software versus Microsoft, were Microsoft not to get into advertising-based software. Google, in effect, has a different source of revenue that, under your current model, you don't have. So that's an example of an intersecting catalyst where the fact that the two-sided platforms, the three-sided platforms, have different sources of revenue turns out to be quite important for survival in the ecosystem.
We're all set? Oh, wait, one more.
In addition to, you mentioned the anchor store
Yep.
concept as one way to jumpstart the platform adoption. What are some of the other common ways of trying to do that?
The common ways of jumpstarting a platform? Well, the common way of jumpstarting a platform is in fact by subsidizing one side to get on board. Sometimes that subsidy turns out to be permanent. In other cases, it turns out to be temporary. So if we go back to the card example, it's very common for card entrants to subsidize consumers early on, and that was in fact the case for Diners Club for about the first year, and then that changed. But typically, the way the thing gets ignited is by figuring out which side you need the most in order to get the other side. And in most cases, there's going to be an answer to that question. Which side needs the other side most? And once you figure out which side needs the other side most, you can subsidize that side or give that side a really good deal in order to deliver it to the other side. And then the other example of jumpstarting one of these multi-sided businesses is engaging in what I would call the one-two punch strategy. And an example of that, an extreme example of that, is what Palm did in order to enter the PDA business, and what Microsoft has done in order to enter the video game console business. So if you take a look at Palm, Palm in its introduction was completely single-sided. It didn't produce its own operating system. It didn't produce its own hardware. But basically, it was in charge. It subcontracted the hardware. It got an operating system from somewhere. It integrated its handwriting software in to the PDA, and it wrote a bunch of applications or bought a bunch of applications and created that as an integrated bundle. So it appeared as a single-sided platform, just like iPod did. But the plan was to do that in order to attract users. So they attracted a lot of users, and then the idea was once they got up to 1 million users or so, which they got very quickly, then they turned on their evangelization machine. They had APIs exposed and started going to developers to try to get developers to do applications. So within 18 months, they had their first developer conference and so forth. So that was an example of igniting the platform by, in effect, controlling one side of the platform tightly until you got the other side on board. Now, in the case of Xbox, when Xbox started, in an ideal world, you guys wouldn't have developed any games on your own. You just would have relied on the extensive group of game developers around the world to do that for you. But no one was certain that Microsoft Xbox would be successful. So to ignite Xbox, one of the things that Microsoft did, and again, this is a not uncommon strategy among these kind of platform businesses, you self-supplied. You went out and developed some of your own games and bought a bunch of game companies in order to deploy their games on the Xbox. And to an extent, Sony did the same thing at its start. But that's not the permanent business model. The long-run business model is to move the game development off unless you happen to discover that you're particularly good at that side of the business, which you could argue in the case of Windows happened to be the case with Office applications. But generally, the plan is to move that off to other people and then to focus on the software platform. So self-supply often turns out to be an interesting way to ignite these platforms. And then the final example, which is really very much like the anchor tenant strategy, is to engage in exclusive relationships. So if you look at real player, if you look at Google at the moment, for example, with syndication deals, those are situations in which the platform is engaging in exclusive contracts in order to build up one side of the market. Yes. As long as she says you could ask one more, you could ask one more.
Have you looked at the effect of these new internet platforms, which essentially reduce friction, whether it's search, whether it's access, whether it's transactional friction?
You said internet backbones.
Internet platforms.
Oh, internet platforms.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What does that reduction in friction and kind of the marketplace effect, bringing these different types of consumers or customers together in a way that reduces the overall cost of that interaction? Have you looked at what impact that has on the economics of these businesses in terms of pricing, in terms of
I haven't looked at it in terms of pricing. I guess I make a couple of observations. One of the results of that new technology is it does lead to a dramatic reduction in the cost of setting up one of these platforms and a tremendous expansion in the amount of economic value that can be generated for different communities around the globe. If you think about these platform businesses, they're really very interesting because they're all in a sense like typical exchange, in the sense that when you and I come together and exchange something and it becomes easier for us to do that, we both become better off because we move a good from its lower valued use into a higher valued use. And what these platforms do is they, in effect, bring different parties together and provide the opportunity to generate that value. And the reason we're seeing so many of these businesses coming into being isn't just because they're cheaper to create now, but because there are so many more opportunities now to generate enormous sums of value by getting people together. And the example that I give in the book is eBay. If you think about and this is a calculation that economists haven't done, but if you think about the value that eBay has generated as a result of providing an efficient platform for small valued, distant transactions to take place, it's enormous. And the reason it's enormous is because you're not just improving the efficiency of an existing transaction by reducing transaction costs, you're permitting transactions that otherwise wouldn't have taken place. So the full sum of the surplus that's being generated by those transactions is being created by that kind of a platform. And there are lots of other examples just like that. If you look at advertising, supported search, or a lot of these things, basically there are transactions and things that are coming into being that previously didn't even exist. And you're therefore, by bringing people together, creating value almost out of thin air. And it's really just a kind of a remarkable aspect of these businesses in how they do it. It's not just making things more efficient, it's really bringing things together and releasing these incredible values that can be had by just bringing different parties together in one place.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.